teach African American history. Over the past year, I've heard personally from teachers and future teachers who have told me that they do not feel prepared to teach African American history, and they are looking forward to hearing the recommendations of our commission. So the Professional Development Subcommittee makes the following recommendations. Go to the next slide. Our first recommendation is to revise Virginia's teacher evaluation regulations and Virginia's uniform performance standards for school leaders to include cultural proficiency efficacy. We think this is very important that school leaders have some training in this area so that they are able to understand what they're asking teachers to do. Right? Number two, require every Virginia educator to certify that they have enrolled in cultural competency professional development by 2022. Okay. A very important recommendation, of course, is to allocate funding and personnel resources to develop and to implement comprehensive professional development in the areas of cultural competency and African American history content for Virginia educators. The commission, our subcommittee talked quite a bit about this one because without adequate funding, we know that this won't go very far. So we put this at the top of the list of our recommendations. Okay, so mandate certification, continuing education units in African American history for all holders of education licenses issued by the Virginia Department of Education. And this also includes initial licensure and renewals. Amend the requirements for licensure endorsements in history and social science to require evidence of course study in African American history, another very important recommendation. Okay. A lot of conversation about this one. We feel strongly about it. Require a credit in African American history as a new requirement for graduation in Virginia. The new elective course in African American history developed by VDOE and WHRO could be used to fulfill this requirement. And those are our legislative recommendations. And we have several general recommendations that we think are very important as well. First, we recommend that we broaden the teaching pipeline to seek out and train diverse teachers. We all know how important it is to have a diverse teaching force, particularly when we're talking about teaching African American history. Another, incentivize universities and colleges to offer courses and professional development on Black history, teaching Black history, and cultural competency for teachers. Courses in professional development should be for secondary and elementary teachers, as well as librarians. And we wanted to make it clear that it's just not for classroom teachers, but for our librarians as well. Next, encourage universities and colleges in Virginia to offer certificates in African American history and or African American studies for teachers and prospective teachers. Enhance Virginia School Climate Survey to include evaluation of culturally responsive school climate and report these outcomes on Virginia's school quality profiles. So next, establish common language between education preparation programs and school divisions that promote equity and inclusivity. And last, develop models for training about implicit bias and culturally responsive pedagogy, which is also very important. Not last, we have a few more. Make family and community engagement a guiding principle in teacher preparation. We think we also need to work on creating a database for resources for educators, ensure that training components include K-8 educators, not just high school teachers, provide content in multiple modes to improve teacher access, evaluate what teaching resources and textbooks need to be retired. We, of course, know that some textbooks do not capture the entirety of the African American experience. Partner with historical and cultural organizations versed in culturally responsive pedagogy and African American history. We also recommend that we develop a model anti-racism educator policy approved by the Virginia Board of Education, and that school divisions review inclusion of culturally responsive teaching and culturally responsive practices as part of division strategic plans. And school boards should include culturally responsive awareness as part of school board's professional development and training. And we also recommend the development of guidelines for culturally responsive teaching and culturally responsive practice in Virginia. These guidelines should be informed by the profiles developed by the Commission and developed in consultation with a list of experts and resources recommended by the subcommittee. And we have that list of experts and organizations in the report. Of course, it is not completely comprehensive, but it's a start. But we will refer you to that to see that list, to the report to see the list. All right. So at this point, I want to turn the mic over to Leah, but I also just want to thank the subcommittee, professional development subcommittee again. It was a pleasure working with them. They were very precise. We spent countless hours working on it, and we think our recommendations really reflect well what we talked about in our meetings, and also that they reflect what the Standards Commission has recommended. Subcommittee has recommended. So I'll turn it over to Leah now.
Can you all hear me? Shake heads. Derek, if you can hear me. Everybody. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good morning, Governor Northam and Secretary Carney and Dr. Lane. What we want to do at this point as a subcommittee is share some of the recommendations specific to how we frame culturally responsive practice for the Commonwealth of Virginia. There are detailed definitions provided within the report from the Commission that represents the research and practice around the nation related to culturally responsive practice, culturally relevant teaching, and culturally relevant pedagogy. And so here you see that our subcommittee framed this work in the following context: that culturally relevant teaching is the acquisition of curriculum knowledge, that cultural proficiency represents a mastery of that knowledge, that culturally responsive teaching is again the application of knowledge, and that anti-racist education represents the strategies that are necessary to support culturally relevant teaching. And then finally, that African American history content and pedagogy has to be an equal component of the professional development provided to Virginia educators to successfully support the teaching of African American history in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So culturally responsive practice, we did want to go through and just define a few terms in the presentation that are also included in a more comprehensive way in the report, are divided into sort of four critical levels by the subcommittee. And those are that we must have culturally responsive schools, culturally responsive leadership, culturally responsive educators, and culturally responsive pedagogy. And that those are the four critical levels that are necessary. Culturally responsive schools represent schools that are safe and secure, inclusive environments where they have universal access to culturally relevant pedagogy that builds onto positive cultural identities for students. And that an educational environment is a culturally responsive school when it is free from implicit and explicit racial and ethnic, as well as gender biases, and that it produces high student academic achievement rates within the state's accountable accountability. We have systems in place that mitigate against racial and cultural tensions, and a climate in which all students and staff have a sense of membership and belonging, and provide forums where both inside and outside of the classroom, where everyone can learn about each other's diverse backgrounds. Those are the critical components of a culturally responsive school. Culturally responsive leadership requires that resources and professional learning opportunities are deployed to advance cultural proficiency, that we evaluate cultural responsive efficacy during teacher observations and evaluations, as expectation of high academic achievement for all students is represented and established by the leadership, that power imbalances based on race, culture, ethnicity, and class are mitigated. Policies and procedures are established to advance an anti-racist school culture and climate. And there's an important distinction in the definition of anti-racist education climate that is specific to that term, beyond just providing equitable or equity and access and inclusive environment and diversity, really hones in on what's required for anti-racism to be present, that we establish in mentoring practices for new teachers and staff in culturally responsive practice, and ensuring the retention and recruitment of teachers of color and teachers who have a demonstrable cultural proficiency. And then finally, that they accept cultural responsiveness as endemic to effectiveness in all aspects of student learning for all student ethnic groups. Culturally responsive educators, again, we provide some key components of what represents a culturally responsive educator for Virginia. It would be an educator who's able to reflect on their own cultural lens, model high expectations for all students, promote respect for student differences, recognize bias in the system, challenge stereotypes, prejudices, racism, and other forms of intolerance and oppression, that they're change agents for social justice and academic equity, that they cultivate relationships beyond the classroom that are anchored in affirmation and validation, and that they engage in reflection of beliefs, behaviors, and practices, and communicate in ways that are linguistically and culturally responsive, both with students, families, and caregivers. And then that culturally responsive pedagogy requires a three-pronged approach that is institutional, personal, and instructional, where the institution recognizes a need for reform of school policies and procedures based on cultural factors, personal, which requires that teachers become culturally responsive, and then instructional, and this gets at the true pedagogy, where educational materials are culturally affirming and they aid in delivering culturally responsive instruction across the system. And then I think we were planning to end here and turn back over to Derek. Dr. Aldridge, what we have done is provided both top recommendations in the form of legislative requests, and then our broader, more general recommendations that support the successful implementation of those legislative recommendations are brought forward later. And then we define the key terms that are necessary in order to support and advance the work in a way that aligns to best practice in research across the nation. And so we'll end this here with just a quote from Ralph Ellison. My slides are sticking, trying to get it to come up. But which is this, that if you can show me how I can cling to that which is real to me while teaching me a way into the larger society, then and only then will I drop my defenses and hostility, and I will sing your praises and help you to make the desert bear fruit. And I think this is the type of system of public education we all aspire to create for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so with that, I turn it back over to our secretary.
Thank you so much, both committee chairs.